Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this ETUI webinar on bridging the gap between climate policy and social justice. My name is Kalina Arabagieva, and I'm a researcher here at the ETUI. And today I will have the huge pleasure of introducing and sharing the first part of today's event, which is a webinar that is open to the public, but it is also the final webinar of the second edition of the ETUI massive open online course, or MOOC, on skills for labor and environmental justice. And so for those of you who are not participants in the MOOC, this is a 6-week online course that ETUI is running, again, for the second time in a row, in which participants explore the relationship between labor and the environment and how environmental concerns can be reconciled with ideas of justice in the world of work. And so this is also the central question of today's webinar, which will discuss some of the tensions that arise between climate action and social justice and how we can address them. Now, over the last years, we have seen an increase in efforts to mitigate climate change across different regions through policy programs, which is, of course, a very welcome development. And for instance, in Europe, this was done through the European Green Deal, which was the flagship initiative of the European Commission. But what we have also seen is how climate change mitigation policies have had disproportionate negative impacts across different groups of workers and different social groups more generally, along lines of class, gender, age, racial or ethnic background, disability, and migrant status, and so on. So, of course, what we're talking about here in terms of social impacts are the impacts on workers in fossil fuel or carbon-intensive industries whose jobs are at risk, and their welfare and that of their families and their communities. But we're also talking about other groups of workers who are affected. We're talking about households with a lower disposable income being more strongly affected by energy price increases, and also less able to invest in low-carbon solutions to, for example, heating their homes or transport. So, and the third sort of group of issues is that we're also talking about the fact of the development of the so-called green industries, including activities like mining critical raw materials needed for net zero technologies, that those can also mean the destruction of traditional livelihoods and the displacement of communities from their land, the health impacts on local communities, as well as the creation of jobs with exploitative working conditions. And here we also need to bear in mind that often social impacts are shifted from the global north to the global south. So against that background, what we've also seen over the last few years is that impacts like these have not been sufficiently considered and addressed by policymakers, which has led to a backlash against climate policies from various corners, including from affected workers and communities. And the legitimate concern here is not only that those most affected are not being given enough support to ensure that they are not left behind, but also that they are not involved and do not have a voice in the decisions being made. And unfortunately, one of the trends that we've been seeing as well is that far-right political parties are seizing on those concerns to gain ground and are presenting climate action as inimical to the interests of working people, which of course we know is not true. We know that the world of work will be strongly affected by climate change, and that those who are already subject to structural disadvantages will again be those who are most affected negatively by climate change. So what we want to do in this seminar is to show that climate action and social justice can go hand in hand, but that we need to make greater efforts to empower and include affected workers and communities. And I have the huge honor of presenting two stellar speakers to tell us what they think about this topic. And so please join me in welcoming Emma River Roberts, who is the founder and co-director of the Working Class Climate Alliance, which is a UK-based international non-for-profit organization that aims to increase the presence of working class voices in the climate movement and helps trade unions and working class communities to campaign for change. And Emma is also a PhD researcher at Goldsmiths University in London, and where she focuses on effective climate change communication methods and the impact of climate change on working class communities. And our second speaker is Dimitri Stevis, who is a professor of international politics at the Colorado State University in the US. And he focuses on the international political economy of environment and labor, with particular attention to environmental labor studies and just transitions. And he used to co-convene the Just Transition Research Collaborative, which some of you may have heard about, and is currently the joint coordinator of the Just Transition and Care Network. And his current research is focusing on just transition along the critical minerals and metals life cycle. So he's the author of many books and articles on this topic, including a recent one from 2023 on just transitions, promise, and contestation, which I would highly recommend. Highly recommend, sorry, that was the word. So Emma and Dimitris will kick off the discussions with an intervention of about 50 minutes each, after which we will take about 30 minutes to ask them some questions that were submitted by the participants in the online course in advance. And then we will have another 20 to 30 minutes to take questions from the live audience. So if you have some questions, please do submit them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen that you can find on Zoom. And the Q&A part will be conducted by the two moderators of the MOOC, which some of you already know quite well. So that is Olga Rubagotti, who is a PhD candidate in labor law at the University of Verona, and my colleague Marwan Labas Agenouni, who is a researcher on occupational safety and health and climate change here at the ETUI. And after the Q&A, we will hear a short wrap-up by our colleague Franklin Kibimbi, who is the education officer responsible for education activities on the topic of climate change and the world of work. And throughout the whole session, on the technical side, we are supported by Alina Kaya, who is a trainer and consultant who supports many of the activities of the ETUI. So thank you to all of you for being here, and let's kick off. So without further ado, I'd like to first turn to Emma with a question to start the discussion. Now, Emma, the Working Class Climate Alliance is an environmental grassroots organization representing and led by the working class, which has been a group that's been subject to systemic discrimination and whose voice has largely been excluded from climate and environmental movements and also the relevant policymaking. So can you tell us a bit more about the challenges that the communities that you represent and that you work with face when it comes to reconciling, or sometimes even choosing, between the material interests on one hand and climate and environmental action on the other hand? And how can we address the really tough cases in which those two objectives seem to conflict? And how can we empower the working class and ensure that they have a say in the development of climate policies?
Yeah, sure. And firstly, thanks for the invite. It's great to see everyone here. For the working class, it's a gamble as to whether the just transition is actually just or unjust. As industries transition to lower carbon forms of production, whether someone's able to keep their job or at least secure alternative employment close to where they're based is completely out of their control. In Luton, in England, over 1,000 jobs have been lost from a van production plant as the manufacturer transitions to producing electric vans. Now, the workers have been told that they can keep their jobs if they're willing to relocate 180 miles away where these new positions will be based. So they'd have to uproot their entire lives and the lives of their families to maintain financial stability. And in 2023, a report by Global Energy Monitor has estimated that almost 1 million jobs will be lost in the coal mining industry by 2050, with workers in India and China being the hardest hit in terms of workers finding themselves out of employment. And policies that aim to prompt more climate-friendly actions through individual behaviour change, such as not buying fast fashion, buying food that's been locally produced, installing solar panels, properly insulating your home, is generally too expensive for working class households. And in some cases, the introduction of new measures can compound their disadvantage through the imposition of additional costs. Now, this lottery of empowerment or disempowerment that the working class are forced to confront in the workplace and their daily lives, it's not exclusive to the just transition or environmental policies more broadly. Rather, it's a typical feature of mainstream policy making. And we've all heard promises from politicians, public figures, and professionals that our lives will improve through new policy initiatives. And while there's certainly been improvements in some areas, overall, for the majority of us, our living standards have diminished. So in the United Kingdom, poverty rates have remained virtually unchanged over the last 3 decades. And in America, total household debt has tripled since 2003, with it taking up on average about 11.3% of someone's income now. So the world's working class are hit first by the impacts of these failed promises. They're hit the hardest and they take the longest to recover from it. And that's even if they're able to recover at all. So if we place ourselves in the shoes of working class communities who've had to endure this depreciation of living standards over much, if not all, of their lives, despite being told that things will eventually get better, and they see the exact same thing happening with regards to the just transition and other climate-focused policies, it's possible to see both how and why ambivalence, if not outright resistance, emerges in response to these proposed changes. And in many places, this is in stark contradiction to their own attitudes towards the environment. So even if people are actively concerned about climate change, that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll support changes in policy that aim to lower emissions. So sticking with the status quo, even if it's woefully inadequate as it tends to be, is often the safer option than supporting changes which might take away what little security they have left. So a lot of working class people are effectively coerced into defending the inequalities responsible for their precarity and for the destruction of the environment, sadly. And these experiences can result in a triple devaluation for working class people. So firstly, job loss and/or climate policies can push them into financial precarity, which secondly causes a loss of dignity, as it means that they struggle or are unable to support themselves and their families. And the impacts of which are often compounded by the third devaluation, and that's social marginalisation from broader society. So unable to support themselves financially because of these changes and potentially having to rely on state support as a result. The working class are rendered culpable for their precarious lives and subsequently vilified by politicians, public figures, and sections of the population. And likewise, they may also face exclusion from environmentalists for having reservations about climate-related policies, which fragments relations and social networks that could otherwise have worked together to secure greater protections for the working class. And it's not uncommon for this to result in people becoming more insular as a result, meaning that they don't involve themselves in the efforts of broader groups fighting for social and/or environmental justice, due to concerns that they'll expose themselves to further instances of social marginalisation. It also leads to a loss of confidence in the efficacy of their abilities. So having seen their quality of lives constantly depreciate over time, coupled with the increasing threat of climate change that no one's been able to curtail, they've come to believe that there's nothing they can do to change things for the better. And that's not to say that all working class communities or trade unions lack agency or have lost confidence in their ability to create change and are unable to secure their material needs without sort of damaging the environment or disadvantaging populations elsewhere. But these efforts, when they work, are not without their challenges, and getting certain groups sort of within the broader community to get involved in the ways that they can isn't always successful. And personally, through my work and the work of the Working Class Climate Alliance, we've encountered sort of three main issues behind these problems. So firstly, in places where there have been relatively few extreme weather fluctuations and/or natural disasters, some people feel that they're not going to be particularly impacted by climate change, so they see little point in taking action. And secondly, the notion of environmental action comes into conflict with ideological beliefs. If people support, this idea of, free markets and it just giving them all the freedom they need in life. And thirdly, as previously mentioned, some people feel that there's nothing they can do to improve their lives, both materially and with respect to the environment, so they don't engage in action. So this leads us to the question as to how we can confront and overcome situations where the material needs of the working class conflict with environmental protections. Now, ultimately, we need legislative change. We need to strengthen workers' rights, to bolster their collective bargaining power, implement a green jobs guarantee so that workers don't feel compelled to defend industries that are ecologically and socially damaging, encourage sustainable consumption practices by offering viable, affordable alternatives. So, for example, nationalising and expanding public transport. And as we know, changes such as these undermine the ruling class's insatiable appetite for profit, which fundamentally means that we're going to have to fight for these changes, and in going up against society's most powerful, I think we can all safely assume that progressive developments won't happen at scale for quite some time. So for this to be able to happen in the future, we need to provide the working class with material resources and support that will enable them to work closely with broader social networks, including policymakers, so they can work together and think about viable alternatives in order to help people reconcile their material needs with environmental action. And a great example of this in action is through the efforts of Possible, who we've worked with a couple of times. So they're a UK-based charity who directly engages with grassroots groups, trade unions and communities to co-create climate-focused policies with them. And last year they published a research report in collaboration with the Independent Workers' Union of Great Britain. And within it, they called for safer routes in terms of like cycling lanes, fairer pay and better access to electric bikes for London's couriers to help lower emissions while ensuring that workers would not be negatively impacted through these changes. They carried out surveys with couriers. They provided a list of policy recommendations, such as introducing scrappage schemes or social leasing policies that would create affordable access to electric bikes, introduce infrastructure that would make cycling safer on the roads, especially in London, where it's actually quite dangerous in some places, as well as acknowledging delivery workers as key stakeholders of traffic schemes and consult with them directly when carrying out engagement or consultation activities. And the policy brief was co-written by the union as well. So it was a truly collaborative project and provided realistic solutions that would support couriers to transition, bolster their personal safety, as well as provide them with greater autonomy, not just sort of in the here and now, but going forward as well. And what's been key to the success of this campaign is the fact that it was truly democratic in forms of decision-making, and we had equal representation of people from different backgrounds from the start, which stands in complete contradiction to the lack of working class representation that's very common in policymaking, and ensures that the local knowledge, which is crucial to ensuring policies meet the diverse needs of the working class, some of which may actually be unknown to professionals because of a lack of personal contact, are taken into account. And I'd say, you know, the question posed to myself by the moderators points to the needs to make this standard practice. You know, how do we empower the working class to have a say in the development of climate policies? And I'd say that this challenge is best approached not just as a matter of empowering the working class to have a say, but also extending this towards all of those that are underrepresented as well. Indigenous and Global South voices, as well as people who don't have professional qualifications, such as a university degree or extensive experience working in the industry. Because as many of us are aware of, climate politics remains disproportionately influenced by white middle-class people from the global north, many of whom have some or all of these characteristics. Now, I'm not saying there's no place for people like that. I'm not asking for myself and Steve to be kicked out of this webinar. The problem is the level of imbalance overall. And it often results in people's needs not being fully met. And this top-down and in some cases Eurocentric approach to decision-making also leaves us vulnerable to attacks by right and far-right politicians, the ruling class and the media, who go to great lengths to say that climate politics is a concern for the woke, liberal, middle-class elite, who care nothing for the plight of working class people. And visible representation isn't a panacea to these issues, but we would be in a much stronger position overall if we were able to, I think, show that to broader populations. Now, a constructive way to approach this is with a perspective of sharing privileges between groups, not just communities, but trade unions as well. So from this perspective, the resources and skills that different networks have are seen as equally salient and crucial to a project's success, such as funding, the ability to reach large audiences via the media and other mediums, the ability to influence legislation, academic knowledge, non-academic knowledge, access to social networks, and so on. You know, it's a privilege to have access to these material resources, just as it's a privilege to have access to local community knowledge that can tell us everything about what changes communities want to see, what they don't want, and how best to engage with residents to implement changes that are not only socially and ecologically beneficial, but have widespread support as well. So by redressing this power imbalance within policymaking, it allows us to re-establish trust between groups because we've eradicated the paternalistic mindset of seeing one group as in need of helping, educating, and or liberating by the other. So instead, this is simply a matter of different groups pooling their resources and expertise together, you know, all of which creates the conditions for us to be able to exert a much greater level of impact and demonstrate the efficacy of how we can make change. So to round off my talk, what we can gather from this is that the challenges working class people face in reconciling their material needs and environmental protection aren't exclusively economic or social problems. It's a combination of both, meaning that the solutions we present in response to these challenges can only be successful if they encompass economic and social concerns too. You know, we can't just present people with facts and statistics with promises of a better life for all and expect this to be enough by itself to garner widespread support. Any attempt to transform livelihoods must also encompass a transformation of how we engage with each other, which we achieve through equal representation and democratic decision-making. So make it a truly collaborative process from start to finish. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, for this intervention. It was truly inspiring, and I think also very informative and eye-opening. And thank you also for the really nice sort of best practice example that you gave. And I'm sure that we'll come back to some of what you said in the Q&A. So thank you so much. So without much more delay, I will turn to Dimitris for his intervention. So Dimitris, your work focuses on the political economy of labor and the environment, with particular attention to power, which we already talked about empowering and balancing power, inequality and injustice, which we also talked about, social divisions of labor, and just transitions. So what do you think are the structural factors that enable or hinder the convergence of labor and environmental interests, be they political, institutional, economic, or even legal factors? And what are some of the solutions and strategies for progress in bringing these interests together? And perhaps also what is the role of trade unions in all of this? Thank you.
Thank you, Karina and all. It is a pleasure to be here from Colorado. My comments aim to place climate change and just transition in a somewhat broader context, because I think this has implications for how we deal with this existential issue. I start with the jobs versus environment frame as a dilemma which is intended to discourage and divide working people. Historically, similar dilemmas include jobs versus health, jobs versus education, jobs versus women's integration to the labor force, and increasingly again, jobs versus immigrants. This does not mean that such transitions do not engender tensions and not affect employment. But treating these dilemmas as commonsensical enhances the structural power of capitalism, whether in its hyperliberal or nativist versions. It leads us to think about symptoms rather than causes. So in order to challenge this framing, I would like to discuss who is affected by transitions, which transitions are worthy of just transitions, and the practicality and promise of the eco-social welfare state, and I use the term very broadly. And I will close by commenting on the role of unions, but also environmentalists in this effort. So let me talk about reclaiming people and just transition for all as my first intervention. A starting point for an alternative framing is to repeat that the largest category of people, other than human beings, is that of working people. That is, people that depend on their employment to survive and that without it would lose their homes, food, health, leisure, or education in a few months at most, if not protected by the social welfare states. And I'm highlighting that for the discussion that follows. Yet there are many well-remunerated workers, whether environmentalists or not, but that's a very small number. So the overwhelming number of people in various movements are also working people. This is something we need to remember, or people depending on working people. Many of them work in sectors such as education or government or healthcare that provides them with more secure employment because of political struggles over the last 200 years. But as the USA and increasingly Europe shows, historical legacies can be undone. So in that vein, if we are going to think about working people as the largest category of people, you can call it working class if you want, but working people, let's use this term for now. In that vein, just transitions are necessary for all transitions because they affect working people. Moreover, just transitions outside of energy, and this is something I want to underscore, do not need and should not be justified in environmental and even more specifically climate reasons. Just transitions are and should be in response to any unjust transitions. I personally understand the urgency of climate change and the ecological reasons for promoting decarbonization. I am of the view, personally, that every transitional policy, whether in a conventionally environmental or social sector, should be eco-social. However, I also think that we should recognize that a wide range of working people are rendered vulnerable and fearful by a variety of different transitions. And if we are going to include them as allies, we need to address their existential fears. For instance, artificial intelligence, like automation and digitalization, will affect the world of work and will shift power relations within capital, between capital and labor, and in terms of state-society relations. It is very energy and infrastructure intensive, so I do not know how it will affect blue and white collar workers, relatively speaking. But I think that most of the white collar workers that will work in AI, artificial intelligence, are not any better remunerated than blue collar workers, and that they also need a just transition. I heard a news item yesterday that only in the entertainment industry, the move to artificial intelligence will displace close to 250,000 people. I don't know if that's in the United States or in the world. So with that in mind, I want to talk about the continuing promise of the eco-social welfare state, using the term in a very general sense. One should say that we need to focus on one transition at a time. Let's start with energy and decarbonization and then move on to something else. I am not of that view. In fact, most people here and everywhere would object if a transitional policy that is important to them is sacrificed to another priority. For example, would women workers in healthcare agree that gender equality, including in leadership positions, would have to wait until we have universal healthcare? Would precarious workers in education or AI agree that their transition out of precarity must wait until the concerns of permanent educational workers are dealt with? It seems to me that just transitions must be holistic and address all transitions, and not only at the level of places and countries, but across production networks. Solutions that externalize cost across space and time generally come back to haunt us, as is the case now in the USA, but also in Europe. I also submit that holistic transitions are arguably more manageable than partial and ad hoc transitions and less costly than neoliberal or nativist policies. Here I will draw on my own research and practice. One of the main problems that the few just transition policies face in the US is that healthcare depends on employment. This is different than Europe. For most people in transition, losing health coverage is the most immediate existential threat. That was a great surprise to us in a couple of research projects that we did. It is not that they are not upset about losing employment income, but many told us that they can survive longer with less income than they could with no or less healthcare coverage. Because losing healthcare coverage and having to pay for healthcare basically means that you have to sell your house, you have to move, you just become destitute. In a case I was involved in a specific just transition policy making, we spent many hours, many days trying to figure out how to ensure health coverage for coal workers until they found another job. We did not find a satisfactory solution for working age people, for younger workers, workers at the height of their working career, including for people that could find jobs but did not provide, those jobs did not provide for satisfactory health coverage. And interestingly, though, that was less of a problem with workers who would fall below a certain income because they would cover by Medicaid, which is the socialized system of medicine in the US for poorer people, or were close to 65 years old because they would be covered by Medicare, which is the policy for socialized form of medicine for people over 65. So here are two major policies that universalized healthcare and made our decision-making easier in dealing with that transition. Also, and this is very interesting, the USA has one of the most, and I put it in quotation marks, socialist organizations in the world, and that is the Veterans Administration. It employs about 500,000 people, has a budget of about $360 billion, and services more than 9 million people a year on a non-needs base. In a country where most benefits are needs-based, you have to show need. So we have these examples in a liberal country like the United States of an effective and efficient healthcare system or systems. And the point that emerged after our discussions, unfortunately, is that had we in place a universal healthcare system similar to the best ones in Europe, we wouldn't have had to spend all the time and anguish trying to figure out how to make sure that transitioning coal miners and coal plant workers will be kept whole. Another question that we had to face was the training and relocation. A public education system that allows people to learn new skills or go back to the university or some training educational institute would help significantly here. You may or may not know, but the US education system is much more flexible than the European systems, but also much more expensive. Yet, even in a place like the United States, public education from kindergarten to the end of high school is socialized. So one point here is that we have many examples of massive welfare organizations, even in the most liberal country in the world. The other point that I should point and suggest is that many of those public services and public funding are very attractive to private investment, particularly finance. So this allows me to address the question about the cost of insurance due to climate change, a question that was shared with me. I think ecological changes, particularly climate change, are affecting everybody, including the largely financialized insurance industry. In my view, the insurance industry has a profound obligation to contribute to the just transition policies that are required to make sure that the poorer people are not further burdened. But in line with my overall argument, I would recommend that risk mitigation and adaptation should become part of the eco-social welfare state, turning insurance fees into taxes and thus lowering the cost of these services for working people. But such a transition should be done justly to avoid harming the many white-collar workers in insurance that will be affected. There's an estimate here in the United States that if we were to have universal healthcare for all, socialized healthcare system, it would affect about 1.8 million people that currently work in the insurance industry. And so we need a just transition for them. So certainly collective agreements can address the cost of increasing insurance, but not, in my view, as a substitute of strong public rules. And we can talk about that a bit more later. I think collective agreements should reflect and enforce comprehensive and inclusive public rules. They should not substitute for them, leading to fragmentation amongst working people. I still think that one of the major differences between most European, not all European, but most European countries in the United States is that the industrial relation systems in Europe is less fragmented than in the US. And I think that the United States industrial system is nothing to emulate. In line of the above, the just transitional policies that are currently being implemented in places such as Colorado, Michigan, Spain, the Ruhr, the European Union, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, and the various proposals from UNFCCC are not particularly ambitious and idealistic. They're very much the product of the specific political realities within which they emerged. One can argue that it was not possible to achieve anything more than what has been achieved. For some social forces, these just transitional policies may also be the desirable ones. But if we take the social democratic welfare state or the democratic socialist welfare state, whatever you want to call it, with all of its significant and problematic limitations, as a harbinger, as prefigurative of what is possible, then in my view, we can have more ambitious just transitions. So rather than having just transitions are events that fall within what we in the Just Transition Research Collaborative labeled as neoliberal and managerial, we should have just transitions that are reformist, at least, and hopefully transformative. So I'm suggesting that the more ambitious just transition, including in the energy sector, including with respect to climate change, requires a deeper, broader, and more democratic social welfare state. I do not think that social welfare policies are more expensive than private policies. In fact, I think they're cheaper. But that is a secondary factor. To even enter the logic of financial costs rather than desirable goals is to accept the logic of the dilemmas that I started with. This does not mean that a robust social welfare society will not face challenges any more than a robust capitalist society does. What is different, as Herman Daly, one of the fathers of ecological economics and anything but a socialist, said in one of his last interviews, and with respect to a transition to a steady state or a degrowth economy, we need some important design principles, some changes in the fundamental design. That is, we need to move into a different logic. So before commenting on the role of trade unions and other social forces, I want to also convey that some transitions are irredeemably unjust, even if supported by some unions or some environmentalists. Transitions in general are not empty of purpose to be filled with just transition or some other kind of regulatory policy. So seeking to humanize or ecologize some transitions is to legitimate them. And I'm not going to mention any examples we can discuss further. And unfortunately, we're seeing some of them. The strategy here is to reject them and resist them up front. There probably will be disagreement about the red line or the boundaries between redeemable and irredeemable transitions and policies. But I hope there is no disagreement that there are such red lines if one aspires to an egalitarian eco-social society. And in a minute or two, let me just talk about the roles of unions in this process. Who are the actors that can make these kinds of transitions happen? I'm sure each one of us can propose actors, both general and specific. In my view, these actors, including labor unions and environmentalists, must have a broad vision of the working people. I fully understand that unions and environmentalists and beyond vary ideologically and organizationally. But I think that organizations that have a broader vision of who the working people are also more likely to move beyond tactics and strategies into political coalitions and political parties. Currently, we know that many working people that belong to unions have migrated to nativist parties, and that is something many people are exploring and should be concerned of us. But it is also worth noting that not all workers or most workers, if we think in terms of working people, have done so. We have tended to think of working people in terms of industrial and manufacturing workers, and I think it's very important for us to broaden that domain. I think that trade unions, one of the most organized segments of society, along with churches, I'm talking about society because, of course, capital is organized in the state, can play a major role in promoting a broader view of the working class and the welfare state. They can also play, and have done and are doing so, play a general role in promoting social environmentalism or an social welfare society. Many will not, and we need to be honest about that. There are unions, there are organizations, there are environmentalists that will not do so. So for me, a major challenge is how to enable eco-social unionism and eco-social environmentalism, allow them to grow and to find some common ground that connects working people. One of the organizations that I have long supported in the USA has regular webinars, which are on what to do when your union breaks your heart. That is, what do you do when your union behaves in ways that you disagree with? In our case, it did break the hearts of those of us in our small union chapter when we were dropped by our union after many, many promises and leaving us alone to fend for ourselves. So I recommend something like it, a webinar like that, or some kind of session for all unionists so that we can keep our eyes on the prize in these difficult times. And for those of you who have seen the Johnny Walker ads, I don't know if you have, let us keep walking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dimitris. Again, so much to discuss. There's so much to talk about. And I think what you said is really interesting about having to consider different transitions, right? Because we can't consider them in isolation, especially working people have different, often competing issues that they have to deal with. That's really important, and I think also speaks to what Emma talked about. So thank you both again very much for your interventions. I think we can now move to the Q&A. Again, we'll first hear from some of the prepared questions, and I think Dimitris, you already addressed one of them. And then we can have some live questions for the Q&A, and I see there's already plenty of questions in the chat. So Olga and Maran, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kalina. And first of all, thank you very much, Dimitris and Emma, for your insightful and thought-provoking presentations. The perspectives shared today have provided us with a deeper understanding of the intersection between climate justice and workers' rights. And we truly appreciate the expertise you have contributed to this discussion. As this webinar, you all know, is part of the ETUI massive open online course, Skills for Labor and Environmental Justice, many of our participants have already reflected on the ideas and viewpoints presented by our speakers today. In this regard, we would now like to pose some of the selected questions that participants have submitted in the platform. And following this, we'll open, as Kalina already mentioned, the floor to the participants and attendees that are with us today. So first, dear Dimitris, I will now read 3 of the questions that we collected from some participants. And if you feel that we have already answered some of them, I can go through the extended list. The first one is, I will read them, the 3 in a row, and then you decide how to manage the rest of the time. Do you believe that the current approach to a just transition is too idealistic and fails to consider the political and economical realities that may prevent its implication? The second one, we have witnessed major developments in AI recently. While there is a potential to improve working conditions for working people, we also know that AI requires massive resources, including water, for functioning. Is it mainly white-collar workers who will benefit from AI developments? Is there a way to ensure that this is not yet another technology that will increase the divide between rich and poor? What is a responsible use of AI, and how can it be shifted away from the individual, but put it in a wider framework? And the last one of the impacts of climate change is the increase in home insurance, and via this also in home affordability in Europe, impacting especially those with least resources. Is there a way to use collective bargaining and labor law to pressure the insurance industry and the fossil fuel industry to pay for the solutions that governments and the EU will have to put in place? The floor is yours, Dimitris. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I commented a little bit on each one of those, and I might take the time to elaborate a little bit without repeating myself. I do not think that the existing just transition policies are as idealistic, as far-reaching as they should be. But I also think, in fact, that some just transition policies are likely to breed resentment and competition in the future because they are very particularistic. They are basically what we in the Just Transition Research Collaborative called managerial or crisis transitions to deal with a particular problem. And we already see the fact that workers in nearby sectors are asking, what about us? What is the situation? So I'm not of the view that just transition policies are idealistic as they exist. Maybe some of the proposals are idealistic. That's a discussion, but not the policies. Some of those policies are very large, perhaps not adequate, but large, but that doesn't necessarily make them idealistic. So that's my view, and we can talk about it more. With respect to AI, I'm learning about it. I don't, we have a big discussion within my university, and I imagine other universities, about the use of AI by students. There are two approaches. One is to prohibit it. The other is what we say in the US, to lean into it, to actually use it, to learn how to integrate AI into being more productive and facilitating what we do. So there are different approaches. But in terms of artificial intelligence as a large industry, as a new industry, the impacts will be similar, I think, to automation and digitalization and all the other transitions. There could be good ones and bad ones. There will be more jobs in some areas and fewer in the other areas. An area where I think some empirical research needs to be done is whether it will create more blue-collar or white-collar jobs. Why am I saying that? The person who asked the question talks about the use of water, but also the use of electricity is enormous. It has, in fact, single-handedly raised the consumption of electricity in the United States. And perhaps you saw that Elon Musk and Donald Trump has launched, I forget what it's called, it has a fancy name of $500 billion plus. It looks like $500 billion is the magic number, whether it's $500 billion for the minerals in Ukraine or $500 billion for the AI initiative in the United States. But the basic thing is to create the energy infrastructure for AI. And that's huge infrastructure, not to mention the use of work. So there are probably going to be a lot of business employment in building that infrastructure. And unfortunately, there are some unions in the US, as there are in Europe, that are looking forward to doing that work without asking the question of what are the implications. So that's something else. But I also think that a lot of the white-collar jobs that will be created will be just mainstream, not particularly well-paying jobs. So I don't think that the distinction between white and blue-collar is as compelling as the distinction between well-paying, secure jobs versus more precarious jobs. And the last one about home insurance. I think the insurance industry really has serious obligations towards the rest of us. And the insurance industry has to not depend on subsidies from the government, amongst other things. And one of the subsidies, certainly in the United States, but I imagine also in Europe, I know in Greece, is that some of the riskiest activities, particularly in places that are affected by climate change, is underwritten by the government rather than the private sector that is moving out, just leaving people without insurance for their houses. Some of those issues emerge in Hawaii and California in the US. But in my view, like healthcare, you are all in Europe, we're familiar to, in most countries, socialized healthcare. Why not have a socialized insurance system? I think that would be the easiest way to deal with this particular problem. So I'm a big advocate of a broadly called eco-social welfare state, not only because it's the right thing to do, but I think it's cheaper. I think it's more administratively efficient. But as I said in my presentation, to me, it's the question of what is desirable, what is appropriate, what is the ecological and humane thing to do. And I like to say that we should avoid discussions about costs as the beginning discussions. We should talk about costs once, like Herman Daly said, we have changed the design. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dimitris, for your answers. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to hear you. I will have the opportunity to exchange more. I see already some questions in the Q&A section, but I would like to pass the floor to my colleague Olga, who will ask the pre-selected questions to Emma Riverovitz.
Many thanks to Dimitris for his inspiring speech and for answering all the questions of the MOOC participants. And thanks also to Kalina and Marwan. But now it's time for questions to Emma, who introduced us to the challenges faced by the communities she works with in balancing their material interests with climate and environmental action, the conflicts that arise between these goals, and ways to empower the working class in climate policy development. So, first of all, thank you, Emma, for your inspiring speech. And here are the question for you. Emma, you criticized the growth movement for overlooking the struggles of the working class. Do you not think that without a radical reduction in consumption and economic growth, any attempts to achieve climate justice will be merely superficial? Second question. What do you think of the role of disinformation and anti-science lobbying? What we can do about it? And last question, what are your views on the cooperation or lack of it between trade unions and grassroots eco-social movements?
Thank you. So with regards to degrowth, I've always been in favour of degrowth in principle. But from my stance, I consider it to be both unviable and a potential catalyst for societal tensions, so long as the representation of working class voices in the movement remains nominal. And this is for the reasons that I laid out in my initial discussion. So on the one hand, we're missing those vital perspectives of groups with regards to certain policy initiatives, which can't be resolved just by people expressing their opinions through focus groups and interviews, which is quite common in environmental policy making in general. And in fact, research has shown that a fair amount of working class people actually resent only ever being like the researched. And although it's been shown, time and time again across countries that there's a lot of support for policies aligned with degrowth's aims, such as universal basic services, which is great, that doesn't mean that they'll lend their support to stopping endless economic growth. As I've mentioned, a wish to stick with the status quo and other factors stands in the way, and that this leaves us vulnerable to attacks by politicians and public figures from across the political spectrum, but especially the right and the far right. Because kind of as I alluded to in my sort of initial discussion, environmentalists have long been painted as this collective of middle-class elites who don't care to integrate themselves with the working class. And with regards to mainstream environmentalism, there is some truth to that in some areas. So from an outsider's perspective, if there's little to differentiate between degrowth and mainstream environmentalism with regards to this representation and the subsequent perspectives that it would bring, it gives an incredibly wide berth for attacks to be thrown along this line of just being another new group of environmentalists, academics and activists who spun all these fancy ideas from the ivory tower, and now they're here to tell us, to take away our freedoms, which is as much sensationalist as it is incorrect. That's an absurd thing to say. But in comparison, look at the successful attacks that these people have cast on heat pumps. How much tension they've managed to stir up over something in comparison to degrowth isn't revolutionary at all. It's a heat pump. And imagine how much worse it's going to be, not if, but when they sink their teeth into degrowth and these proposals that aim to upend the power of the ruling class, which is their power. So from a social justice perspective, any attempts to reimagine new ways of knowing and inhabiting the world without an inward reflection of class positionalities and the way that someone's class position has entrenched inequalities further, provides an incomplete picture of class-based oppression in daily life. The good news is that there's been an increase in class analysis from an orthodox Marxist perspective, but seeing everyone who has to sell their wages for labour as working class, if we're thinking in the context of everyday interactions and, you know, answering the golden question as to how to build a diverse movement, we cannot neglect considerations to the qualitative dimensions of class. So, for example, differences in values, behaviour, taboos, which I've seen like a Marxist perspective at times doesn't place a great deal of focus on it. And if anyone is interested in reading more about that, Betsy Leonda White is amazing for this. She wrote a book called Missing Class, and she talks about how the qualitative dimensions are necessary to take on board when we're sort of getting together and trying to build a movement. So it won't resolve, you know, everything, but seeing, instead of degrowthers, you know, I suppose, struggling to find a leg to stand on in the face of these attacks, they'd be able to flip the narrative and say, well, actually, we have these visible supportive communities, and it's not just a collective of people living super alternative lifestyles. They are the everyday people you claim to speak on behalf of. So I'm in support of degrowth, and I've always been in support of it, but I do have reservations sort of on that front. With regards to the disinformation, it's a big worry. The World Economic Forum's listed mis and disinformation as the greatest risks that we'll face over the next 2 years, and one of the greatest risks to society that we'll have to contend with over the next decade. And especially with the rise of AI and social media that's effectively unregulated in terms of fact-checking. And for people who aren't actively involved in environmental activist networks and who get their sources of information about climate change from like social media, as well as right-wing news outlets and so on, it's a perfect storm for disinformation to be taken as fact, especially where the science around climate change and information about how the economy works can be quite complex at times. And if disinformation is presented to people in a compelling manner, which it often is, by people and mediums that they trust, it's common to just accept this information. You don't always fact check people that you trust. Now, with anti-science lobbying, I would love to say that we can just put them in a rocket and just shoot them into the sun, but I don't think that's going to be possible. So we need to look at the ways that we can change things sort of on the ground. Broadly, lobbying can be split into 2 categorizations. So we have direct or indirect. And direct lobbying involves direct contact between the lobbyist and decision makers like politicians. And indirect lobbying is when the lobbyist aims to influence policy by shaping and mobilizing the support from the broader public. So, for example, through the media, websites, or funding climate skeptic groups and studies. And in terms of countering both disinformation and sort of anti-science lobbying, it fundamentally comes down to education, but there is a right and a wrong way to do this. And groups that refer to climate skeptics or deniers as ignorant or stupid are setting themselves up for failure. There's a lot of confusion surrounding some of what we consider to be the most basic terms in climate politics, especially when it comes to global warming versus climate change. And additionally, a partial or total rejection of the science is actually being found to be rooted in fear over the impacts of climate change amongst certain groups. So the actual reasons that drive these types of responses from the broader population are multifaceted. So we need to approach educational programs from a place of understanding and sometimes patience. And so, you know, just firing facts and statistics in the face of people who actually believe it can have the opposite impact of alienating them further. So at the highest level, legislative change, putting restrictions on lobbying is needed. And I think we should continue to put pressure on governments. But in the meantime, we should aim to deflect the impacts of indirect lobbying and disinformation through ways such as community outreach, so on-the-ground educational programs. But I don't think getting people into a room and lecturing them or running a workshop is particularly helpful in these situations, but rather actively immersing people and involving them in group nature-based activities. So, take away the abstract concept of climate change and physically, ask them to show you what changes they've seen, declining rates of insects and birds, the fact that flowers and other fauna aren't coming into season when they used to, literally go through it step by step with them. And through this continued contact over weeks, if not months, it builds this solidarity and this trust so people can, join the dots together eventually. So yeah, it's important to link up climate change beyond its ecological and economic impacts, which amongst those where it's still quite an abstract concept, we can discuss it in relation to physical changes as well, through health, so pollution, water quality, people's breathing, quality of sleep. It's a way of making the abstract tangible and relatable. And in regards to my views on the collaboration or lack of between trade unions and grassroots eco-social movements, getting the ball rolling here can be very, very difficult, and for many reasons. And where we know, obviously the purpose of any trade unions to protect the interests of its workers, this can come into conflict with the aims of eco-social movements. If the interests of workers are being protected in an ecologically and or socially harmful manner, but it can also create diverging aims within the union itself. So by this, I mean those who yield the greatest influence over the union's aims, such as people occupying professional managerial positions, can take these aims in a completely different direction than the climate-focused direction its members would like it to go in. And we get this in the UK. We get the rank and file members saying we'd like a different change of policies. We're trying to vote it through, and we just can't. And at the same time, there remains a fair degree of animosity from some trade unionists about the intentions of eco-social movements more broadly. So interviews with trade unionists in India found a unanimous agreement that addressing climate change is something that must be urgently done, but their attitudes towards the just transition were ones of deep skepticism. And because of a lack of involvement in discussions and policy proposals with groups in the global north, they considered the just transition to be a Western-defined and imposed framework, not just on their country, but on all countries in the global south. So, but in better news, there's been some really great examples of collaboration between trade unions and environmental movements. The Florence GKN workers fight, to keep their jobs whilst developing alternative, socially beneficial forms of production that isn't ecologically damaging is a brilliant example of recent times of successful trade union collaboration with the broader climate movement. So like in a nutshell, after the workers were sacked in 2019, they occupied the factory and organized. They engaged with Fridays for Future, other climate groups, academics, all sorts of other people. They pulled all their knowledge together. And when their wages were stopped, a system of mutual aid was introduced, so those continuing the occupation could sustain their lives. And 6 years on, the struggle continues. And for me, what I think has really helped to keep the momentum going in this struggle and would help eco-social movements connecting with trade unions going forward is that the emphasis is not on this just being a workers' issue, and it's not just a climate issue. The proposed changes were for the benefit of the broader community to reorient production to produce, socially beneficial goods. So it's for everyone. So in line with the earlier themes, I discussed the challenges that appear with regards to trade union and grassroots collaboration are both material and social. Sometimes I consider the problems to be impenetrable, especially when the internal politics of a trade union is, really fragmented. I'd always recommend for grassroots groups to try and connect with a trade union's climate justice caucus if they have one. Make those on the ground connections and show that you're willing to listen to their concerns, and to make it clear that in circumstances where material needs conflict with environmental protections, that your intentions are to work together and create alternative, tangible solutions. But just to round off here and to summarize, it's incredibly difficult. Yeah, it's very challenging. For us, we are working with a trade union. We can't announce it just yet, but it's taken us about 6 months to get to the point where they said, yeah, let's go. It's a long process. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma. We already have some new questions for you, Emma and Dimitris. So now I want to give the floor to my colleague Marwan, who is going to read them and the comments you all participants have sent us through the chat.
Thank you very much, Olga, and thank you all the participants for those questions that are popping out now in the Q&A section. But before going to those questions, I would like just to invite Emma and Dimitris to feel free to reflect on the other speaker questions if they would like to do so. And at the same time, I would start reading the questions. I will read them all because we have 11, or no, yes, 11. So you choose which ones you feel more confident or more that are more appropriate for you. First of all, from Daniel, economic growth or degrowth? How important are redistributive policies? The second one for Emma, can you clarify your definition of working class? The third one, which is for Dimitris, what do you think might be the consequence of the shift of the EU trying to keep up with the US with the regulation for the EU industry? And as a consequence, the jobs that will be affected? Seems like the Draghi report is followed like a Bible, competitiveness over everything. Also from Ioannis, taking into account Dimitri's comments regarding the unions letting down workers, we see collective bargaining agreements decreasing across EU. Without them, just transition will certainly fail. How can we prevent or reverse this? Question from Peter Austin. The UK and the US are less typical compared with Northwest Europe. How would they reflect on the possibility of strengthening tripartite trialogues in developing climate policy with more social justice? An example of this was the energy support package, which was negotiated by employers, workers, and the government in 2023 in Norway. A question from an anonymous. Can the new social contract promoted by ITUC and ACTRAF be of any relevance for climate policy and social justice in Europe? Also a question now from Rory. Do you believe that the American Republican Party's skeptical view of just transition and especially climate change will reinforce the parties of the far right in the world and seriously hinder hopes of substantial policy change when it comes to just transition? Also, a question for Dimitris from Moreno. Super interesting. You mentioned about the relationship between healthcare and acceptance of green policies. Can you add something on it? And a last question from Gerald. Workers in jobs that are not good for the environment and for decarbonization often still cling strongly to their jobs. In some unions, they as union members also oppose change. In the end, they will lose their jobs. How to promote to get workers along to not oppose what is also in their own interest, as long as it is a just transition? If you didn't understand properly a question, you can repeat it. without any problem. So the floor is yours. Maybe we can start with Emma.
Yeah, sure. I'll go top down. Economic growth or degrowth, degrowth, or whatever somebody wants to call it. Redistributive policies here are key. Especially, it's difficult. I am obviously in favour of redistributive policies. What we've seen, and especially in the UK, is this notion of the undeserving poor. The fact that some groups are getting help from the state as they have every right to. And it's resulting in this increase in nationalist thinking. So that's when we're talking about redistributive policies, again, with me, it's always going to come back to the social. We need to also think about how we can reorient how we look at people from other parts of the world. But it's key, especially, you know, childcare, for example. A lot of people aren't having children even though they'd like to, because it's just too expensive. So yeah, better sort of impacts for everyone all round. In terms of my definition of working class, I see it as a combination of material and social elements. So on the one hand, it's impacted by like your income, where you come from, how much your parents earn. But then on the social aspect, it's also about the things that we learn and pick up through the networks that we're surrounded in. So for example, how we speak, accent and dialects are a big thing, how we dress, our values, the way sort of we like to present and behave. It makes it slightly challenging when we're trying to like fill out a box and categorize it. But to me, this approach, I think, provides a much more realistic way of seeing the everyday class experience, especially when a working class person's achieves social mobility. For example, myself, and I'm doing sort of the type of work is literally unheard of where I come from. But you often feel in between classes. You don't fully feel working class nor middle class, and also vice versa. If a middle class person experiences downward mobility, they could feel in between as well. Let's have a look. I just want to touch on the American Republican Party's skeptical view of the just transition. I think it will reinforce the parties of the far right. And I think what we're seeing a lot of actually sort of across countries is that allegedly left-wing politics is now starting to shift further to the right because they're trying to attract the right-wing voters, which is going to push the right even further to the right. And I think that's why we need sort of both a strong trade union movement, a strong sort of working class movement, because I don't think we can rely on politics, mainstream politicians to take us back. I think it's just going to keep going. I'll let Steve take a couple. Might jump back in a sec.
Thank you very much, Emma. Dimitris, can...
Yeah, but I mean, I don't have the answers. I appreciate the questions. I don't have the answers, but I have some comments. I do think what we are observing on a worldwide basis is what people have called a race to the bottom or a downward harmonization. And I think the shift of the United States towards more hyper-liberalism, but combined, I think it's very important with very strong geopolitical competition, colonial, basically, competition at the global level, creates some very, very serious problems. I think that even during the Biden administration, the policies of the Biden administration about critical minerals, about high-end strategic sectors was one that was encouraging geopolitical competition between the United States and China, but also between the United States and the European Union. So now with the more even resolute geopolitics of the Trump administration, I'm really concerned that the impacts will be even more profound but they won't be impacts under normal conditions of neoliberalism or hyperliberalism, but they will include a very strong nativist element. It's not surprising that amongst the leaders of the European Union, Orban has come to the support of Trump. The tripartite dialogue, it's not really a case in the United States. It has never been, with the exception, there's bipartite dialogue amongst the conservative unions, or what they call business unionists in construction and trades, and employer associations. It's a very interesting sort of peculiarity of the United States. But in the US, we do not have tripartite or multipartite dialogue of any kind, with few exceptions here and there, but at the local level. The social contract of the ITUC and ACTRAV, is it of relevance? I definitely think, but we have to ask the question of what kind of a social contract. We have been talking about the need for a new social contract, but I think we have to ask the question, what kind of a social contract? Because at the risk of being very, very, very provocative, I think that the National Socialist Party in Germany had a social contract with certain social forces at the expense of other social forces. So it's very important for us to ask that question. And I don't know if you saw the interview between Musk and the chair or the president of the AfD, but it was interesting noting that she felt that Hitler was not a was not a liberal, was not a libertarian, was not in favor of markets. He was a communist. The language is becoming, I think, a very convoluted one. Emma talked about the Republican Party. I don't think they ever had much respect for just transition or for energy transition. However, it's worth noting that the energy transition in the United States will continue because the leaders with respect to renewable energy in the United States are very conservative states like Texas, like Florida, like Iowa, but not as part of a climate policy, not as part of a green transition, it's just another business opportunity. So all of those states, in addition to having renewable energy, they also have carbon, oil and gas, and whatever else. So a question about healthcare and green policies. I mean, the healthcare industry is a major consumer of energy. It's like 5 or 10% of the world's emissions. But it's also a very major consumer of all kinds of disposable products, very toxic products. But the point I was trying to make is not that necessarily the service sector is a more green sector, but that the service sector, the care sector, is also facing its own transitions, a variety of transitions, and that it is important for us to recognize them because quite frequently, or generally speaking, those sectors involve primarily women and a significant number of unprotected immigrants, certainly in healthcare, domestic care, education, in terms of educational, upkeep of buildings. That's the meaning. Maybe I misunderstood, but that's what I had in mind. I think that's it, right? How to persuade workers. I don't have the answer to that. I think that we're having a big debate all over the world. A number of my own union in the education sector has come up with a climate justice resolution pushing for change. I think it's very important to keep in mind this, and I'm going to close with that. I think we should emphasize on energy workers. Absolutely. I mean, they are really very much the target. But we should not underestimate the fact that the quote-unquote service sector, healthcare, education care, administrative care, and all those sectors are a substantial force in the economy. If those sectors were to change the energy they use, if they would concentrate together, say, we're going to use more wind power, more solar power, more renewable power, or cut down on the consumption of energy, use more public transportation, and on and on and on, that will have an amazing impact on the economy as a whole, on moving us towards a decarbonized economy. And this is the reason why I brought in those sectors, that they have a significant role to play. And we should not underestimate their ability, if organized, if unified, if they talk to the energy workers, in shifting the balance in the direction of the working class and people. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dimitris. And thank you very much, Emma, for your questions. We have no further questions in the Q&A section, but I would like to share with you a question that also a participant has proposed in the MOOC, and it would be like a last question. Then we will pass the floor to Franklin to close the event. And this question is about just cessation, a topic that Frances Flanagan from Australia has already tackled. And the participant asked, what are your views on the best possible ways and opportunities to modify the just transition policies and discourse in Europe and also in the United States, so we can incorporate this idea of just cessation, which relates to the idea of justice in the cessation of harmful practices or activities?
Emma.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think for me, the best ways, or at least certainly the ways that we've had the greatest success, is where we boil it down to the home effectively, and we boil it down to things like health, to the community, to people that they know, how just transition policies are going to impact health, for example, heat in the workplace, excessive heat. And we say to people, look, this isn't just a workers' issue. This is your life. This is how it impacts your family, how it impacts your ability to go out and spend time with your community. And I think actually extending the concept of a just transition beyond sort of your four walls at work or the gates or whatever is powerful, because it evokes genuine feelings of care for the people around each other. Yeah, for us, I think that's a very powerful thing, and especially when people want to obviously protect the environment, not just for themselves and their children, but for other people's children. So it creates, I suppose, this intergenerational kind of way of thinking and care. So yeah, to me, that is the best way that sort of we've been able to, I think, bring people on board who perhaps have been a little bit disenfranchised with sort of just transition discourse overall.
I agree with them absolutely. I think that the explicit term just transition was first used by progressive labor environmentalists in the United States as a way of expanding the social welfare state. And I'm using the term social welfare state, because that was their goal. They wanted to be like Europe as they understood it. They wanted to be more democratic socialists. And the reason is that they saw just transition as an additional component of the social welfare state. And I think that's very important for us, along with what Emma said, to highlight the fact that the social welfare state is really a series of examples of just transitions. Just transition for people moving from employment age to retirement, just transition for people who got injured at work, just transition for young people into the labor force, just transition for training and retraining and unemployment and leisure and what have you. So the explicit, in my view, the explicit concept of just transition should be thought of as an addition or an integration into the social welfare state, the eco-social welfare state. And as I pointed out in the example in the United States, if we had in the United States a universal healthcare system, a lot of the transition problems that the workers are facing would have been addressed. So I think that this broader narrative with practical implications is worth thinking about.
Thank you very much, Dimitris, and thank you again, Emma. Now I want to give the floor to Frank Plan for our official conclusions.
Yes, thank you so much, Holger, and thank you so much also, Emma and Dimitris, for this brand contribution to our debate on the question of climate policy on one hand and also social justice on the other hand. If I may just try to summarize some of the key ideas that we have discussed here, I would just start with the question of empowering working class people. And it was strongly emphasized by Emma when you talk about the need to try to create some kind of collaboration between, on one hand, a social movement, but also a trade unions movement. So that means that the importance that you really emphasize here, the importance of a democratic approach, that means some kind of co-creation in the way we create climate policy, very important part. Also, and it's particularly important for us here at the ETUI, you also re-emphasize the role of collective bargaining and workers' rights, also another way to empower workers in this question of climate change versus social justice. When it comes to the question of just transition, Dimitris, you also try to be really little bit very provocative in a way that to try to challenge also the way we frame the discussion and the way we have framed the discussion about this dilemma. So what I here have in mind is that you as it was just said, no, you re-emphasize the importance to have a very holistic approach when it comes to just transition. We must address all the transition, and it was just said just in a moment. But it's not only about that. It's also a question of ambitions. And you told us that we really need to be much more ambitious when it's come to just transition policies. And again, it was said by Emma, the question of democratic institution, the role of social democratic state is also very important in this regard. I would say that last point, and it was also for us very important when we talk about the role of trade unions, a reflection on what is behind the words of, a working class. What is the working people? You said that they are the majority, but we also need to broaden the vision, the domain, the perspective, and the meaning of this concept. So in a nutshell, I would say these are some of the ideas that we share. I would like to also now to thank our audience for their participation, and specifically also all of you who contribute to your questions. I hope that you enjoy this moment, and hope that you will have also a moment with us through the various webinars and also occasion that we propose here at the ETUI. So on behalf of my colleague of Kalina, Marwan, and also Olga, on behalf of the research department and the education department of the ETUIs, I'd like to thank you, all of you, for this participations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you also from me.
Thank you.